Something happened quietly inside the halls of policy last month that almost nobody in mainstream financial media stopped to cover properly. A major bloc of industrialized nations formalized a legal framework, giving their member governments the authority to classify specific raw materials as protected strategic assets. That means those governments now hold the power to step directly into the open market, acquire physical supplies of critical metals, remove them from commercial availability, and lock them into national reserve programs. I have spent the last 11 years studying how regulatory decisions create commodity price events before the general public even hears the story. And I'm telling you right now, this framework is not bureaucratic paperwork. It is a loaded spring under a very heavy door. Here is the number that should make you pause. The countries inside this bloc currently import over 85% of their processed lithium, more than 60% of their refined cobalt, and roughly 40% of their industrial-grade silver from supply chains running directly through regions experiencing active geopolitical instability right now. The framework does not immediately restrict those imports, not yet. What it does is open a 12-month window for bilateral supply negotiations with key partner nations. If those negotiations fall short, a pre-authorized mechanism activates. Minimum floor prices on incoming processed minerals become enforceable. State stockpiling programs receive immediate funding approval, and the entire import calculus shifts overnight. That is the event. That is what is already in motion. And if you think this story belongs to investors in one region only, keep watching. Because when one major import market changes its rules, every other market reprices around that change. Subscribe to this channel right now because what I am about to show you will permanently change how you read the metals market. The world does not have a shortage of raw metal in the ground. That is not the problem. There is silver in the earth, there is lithium, there is cobalt. The crisis has nothing to do with geology. The crisis lives in the step between the ground and the finished product. That step is called processing. And right now, critical mineral processing is concentrated in a dangerously small number of locations on this planet. More than 70% of the world's refined cobalt output flows through a single country's infrastructure. More than 60% of global lithium processing capacity sits inside 2 countries. Industrial silver refining runs through corridors that Western governments increasingly label as pressure points in their classified briefings. The word vulnerability keeps appearing in documents that used to only discuss military hardware. Here's the thing experts in policy briefings understand but rarely say clearly on camera. Owning a mine does not mean you control supply, you control dirt, you control ore. But unless you can process that ore into the industrial form that manufacturers actually need, you are just a landlord sitting on unused land while everyone else controls the factory. The value is not in the ground, the value is in the transformation. Let me give you an analogy that makes this concrete. Imagine a fishing village that catches more fish than anyone on the coast, but the only facility that can clean, package, and freeze those fish for sale sits in another town, owned by someone else. That village can haul in record catches every single day, but the moment the packaging facility raises its fees, slows down operations, or decides to prioritize other suppliers, the village loses control of its own income. The fish are not the problem. The bottleneck is the packaging step. That is precisely where the developed world finds itself with critical minerals right now. The mining exists. The refining and conversion capacity does not exist in the right places, and building that capacity takes a decade or more. You cannot fast-track a refinery the way you can fast-track a press release. So what is the immediate lever a government reaches for when it cannot build its way out of dependency quickly? It reaches for import pricing control. It says we cannot change the supply chain overnight, but we can change what it costs to bring processed material through our borders. That is what a minimum pricing framework delivers. And once a government has that lever in hand, the behavior of every private buyer in that market changes before the lever is ever pulled. When procurement teams at automotive manufacturers and defense contractors read that a government now has the legal authority to compete with them for the same refined cobalt and lithium they need, those teams do not wait calmly. They move. They call suppliers. They push for early contract renewals. They lock in forward delivery schedules. And that private sector scramble begins pushing price weeks and sometimes months before the government places a single order. The announcement is the starting pistol. The private sector is the sprinter. Take a moment right now and ask yourself honestly, when did you last review what materials actually sit inside the supply chain of your portfolio? Do you know whether the companies you hold are buyers or sellers of processed critical minerals? Do you know how exposed those companies are to the exact dynamic I just described? If this is landing differently than the usual metals coverage you see online, hit subscribe, because the section coming up is the part most analysts do not break down. I am going to walk you through the exact sequence of events that turns a policy directive into a price shock, step by step. You do not want to arrive at that section without context. Let me show you what the data actually says before we talk about the mechanism. Between 2020 and late 2024, battery-grade lithium moved from below $9,000 per ton all the way to over $82,000 per ton, then crashed back to roughly $22,000. That is not a commodity market behaving normally. That is a market where processing capacity cannot keep pace with political promises about electrification timelines. Demand projections pulled prices to levels that could not be sustained. Then a temporary processing glut collapsed them again. The wild swings are a symptom of structural fragility, not speculation alone. Cobalt shows an even sharper pattern. The metal hit $94,000 per ton in 2018, fell to under $30,000 by 2023, rebounded to $78,000 by 2022, and sits today at a level that makes it nearly impossible for manufacturers to build reliable long-term cost models. One refinery slowdown in Central Africa can move the entire global price within weeks. That is not a mature market. That is a single point of failure wearing a commodity label. Here is the figure that should anchor your thinking. Independent research from a major investment bank estimated that meeting stated global electrification commitments through 2035 would require a 300% increase in processed cobalt output, a 450% increase in refined lithium capacity, and close to a doubling of available industrial silver in usable form. Not raw ore, processed product ready for manufacturing. The infrastructure needed to close that gap does not currently exist anywhere near the regions where demand is growing fastest. Let me tell you about someone I know. His name is Marcus. He is 58 years old, a retired materials engineer who spent 22 years working in supply procurement for a large industrial manufacturer in Northern Europe. A few years ago, Marcus moved a meaningful portion of his retirement savings into a diversified battery metals fund. He was not gambling. He understood the underlying demand story better than most people I have met. He believed in the long-term direction completely. But in early 2023, that fund dropped more than 30% in 9 months. Not because the demand story collapsed. Battery demand kept growing throughout that period. He lost money because he misunderstood the difference between long-term fundamental value and short-term processing economics. A wave of new refinery capacity came online in a compressed window. It temporarily swamped the market with supply. Prices fell hard while the demand thesis remained intact. Marcus was right about the destination. He was wrong about the road. He told me recently that the lesson that stuck was this: the metals market does not reward being right. It rewards being right at the right time in the right part of the supply chain, and identifying which part of the chain is currently the constraint is worth more than any price chart. He tracks refinery utilization rates the way equity investors track earnings reports. And he said something last month that I have been thinking about ever since. He said the next significant repricing will not announce itself with a headline. It will show up first in the forward contract activity of 4 or 5 industrial buyers who cannot afford to be wrong. Look at what happened when Japan faced rare earth export restrictions from China in 2010. Certain rare earth prices increased by more than 600% within 12 months. Japanese manufacturers paid crisis premiums. European electronics companies scrambled for alternatives. The United States reopened dormant domestic mining projects that had not been active for nearly 2 decades. An entire global supply chain repriced in less than a year because a single government used resource access as a negotiating instrument. That was not an anomaly. That was a demonstration of what happens when processing leverage is exercised. Drop a comment right now and tell me this: are you seeing your industry or any company in your portfolio starting to talk more about raw material costs and supply security? Are procurement delays showing up in sectors you follow? Thousands of people in this community track these exact signals. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because the next section is where the mechanics come together. I am going to show you the precise sequence that transforms a policy document into a market event. Here is the mechanism. Walk through this slowly because understanding it changes how you interpret every metals headline going forward. Think about a city highway system on a normal weekday. Traffic moves, nobody panics, supply of road space roughly meets demand. Now imagine the regional weather authority announces that a major ice storm will close 3 key interchange points tomorrow morning. Instantly, the behavior of every driver changes. People who plan to travel tomorrow leave tonight. Gas stations on the main routes run low, not because of the storm itself, but because everyone decided to move at the same time to avoid being caught. The storm has not arrived. The roads are still perfectly clear, but the behavior is already disrupted. That is exactly what a government policy announcement does to a commodity market. The restriction is the storm. The price move is the preemptive evacuation, and the critical insight is that the storm does not have to arrive for the damage to be real. Here is the actual sequence as it unfolds in practice. In the first stage, a policy framework gets quietly formalized. It gets covered in trade publications as a regulatory technicality. Most retail investors scroll past it entirely. In the second stage, within a matter of weeks, procurement managers at major battery manufacturers, defense suppliers, and grid technology companies read those same trade publications. They schedule internal reviews. Some of them quietly begin accelerating supply contract renewals. In the third stage, industrial commodity traders begin noticing unusual forward contract volume in cobalt, lithium, and silver markets. They cannot yet explain it clearly, but they recognize that someone larger than them is repositioning. In the fourth stage, prices begin drifting upward. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent bid that does not go away when you expect it to. Financial journalists write pieces asking why industrial metals are quietly strengthening. 3 analysts provide 3 different explanations, and none of them mentions the policy directive specifically. In the fifth stage, a government official makes a public statement confirming that negotiations with supplier nations are underway, and that the minimum pricing provisions of the directive are ready for activation if those talks fall short. In the sixth stage, the market connects all the dots at once. What was a quiet drift becomes a sharp repricing. Months of gradual accumulation compress into weeks of rapid movement. By this point, the buyers who acted in stages 2 and 3 are already positioned. The buyers who acted in stages 4 and 5 paid a meaningful premium. The buyers who only show up in stage 6 pay whatever the market demands. Most people who watch markets watch for stage 6. The entire advantage is in stages 2 and 3. Now let me take the counter-argument seriously because it deserves a real response. Some analysts argue that minimum pricing frameworks almost never get fully enforced. They point to historical trade negotiations where strongly worded frameworks quietly dissolved without teeth. They argue that political will to announce a restriction is always stronger than political will to implement one. In past decades, that argument often held, but the conditions that made it hold no longer exist in the same form. What sits beneath this policy directive is not a discretionary trade preference. It is the raw material requirement for every major infrastructure and defense commitment these governments have already publicly made. If you have told your population you will electrify the grid, manufacture domestic electric vehicles, and modernize your defense systems, you cannot back away from securing the material inputs for those commitments without publicly admitting you cannot deliver what you promised. The political cost of non-enforcement just became higher than the political cost of enforcement. That inversion is new, and it is consequential. There is one more layer. When one major import bloc signals willingness to set minimum prices, other blocs respond. Some nations race to sign alignment agreements to gain preferred supplier status. Others begin redirecting their processed output toward alternative buyers at premium prices. Others quietly authorize their own sovereign stockpile programs. Each of those responses tightens available supply on the global open market further. The result is not a regional price story. It is a global repricing story triggered by one bloc's regulatory decision. Right now, this story is still unfolding in its early chapters. The window between the announcement and the full market repricing is the window that matters most for preparation. New to this channel? Subscribe right now. The pattern I am watching now echoes the rare earth disruption that caught most of the market completely unprepared. Every week that passes without a clear framework puts you 1 week closer to the point where options become expensive rather than affordable. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and check the description for the complete resource guide. The window is open. It will not stay open. Here is what you actually do with this information. 5 specific steps, not general advice, concrete actions. The first step is to separate the metal price from the processing price. These are not the same number even when they appear on the same chart. When you look at cobalt or lithium price data, you are seeing a blended signal that mixes mining output economics with refining capacity economics with shipping costs, with geopolitical risk premiums. If you want a real read on where price is going, you need refinery utilization data tracked separately from mine production data. A mine producing at record output while the single refinery processing its material runs at 55% capacity is not a bullish supply story. It is a bottleneck story about to become a price story. Refinery utilization data is publicly available for most major metals through industry associations and government statistics offices. Most investors never look at it once. The second step is to track offtake agreements and long-term supply contracts as leading indicators. When a large industrial manufacturer or a government procurement agency signs a fixed-price multi-year supply agreement for processed critical minerals, they are communicating their private forecast publicly. Nobody locks in a price years in advance unless they believe that price will look cheap by comparison to where the market is heading. These agreements appear in corporate press releases, regulatory filings, and trade industry publications. Build a habit of scanning for them. They are quieter than headlines and more reliable. The third step is to watch the refining margin as a leading indicator rather than the spot price as a lagging one. The gap between raw ore value and processed product value tells you precisely where constraint is tightest in the supply chain. When that gap expands, processing capacity is being squeezed harder than mining capacity. Expanding refining margins appear reliably ahead of spot price moves and ahead of the headlines that eventually explain those spot price moves. Multiple commodity databases provide this data free of charge. The fourth step is to understand the difference between what you legally own in an exchange-traded fund and what you would actually hold if you owned allocated physical material directly. In normal market conditions, the distinction is almost academic. In a supply shock or policy intervention scenario, the distinction becomes urgent. Exchange-traded instruments can and do diverge from physical market pricing during periods of stress, because the instrument is a financial promise and the physical metal is the actual thing. Physical holders carry no exposure to refinery shutdowns, shipping route disruptions, or counterparty solvency questions. Know precisely what your exposure represents before the moment when the distinction matters. The fifth step is 15 minutes per week of policy monitoring. That is it. You do not need to read everything published across all jurisdictions. You need to scan for a short list of specific phrases: strategic reserve, minimum import price, critical raw materials designation, processing security framework. When those phrases appear with increasing frequency across multiple major economic blocks within the same calendar quarter, that convergence is a signal worth acting on. One occurrence is a data point. Repeated convergence across jurisdictions is a pattern. One final warning: do not let a clear directional thesis push you into position sizes that assume the timing is precise. Every experienced commodity investor has been right about a structural theme and still lost money because they sized as if timing was certain when it never is. Direction can be correct. Magnitude can be correct. Timing can still be off by 8 to 20 months. Build positions that allow you to stay solvent and patient long enough to be right at the right time. Let me put this all together clearly. A formal policy framework now gives a major block of importing nations the legal tools to impose minimum prices on processed critical minerals and to run state-directed stockpile programs. The 12-month negotiation window is active. Private sector buyers are already adjusting their procurement timelines. The underlying structural demand driving this story, grid electrification, defense modernization, electric transportation build-out, does not disappear based on how any single negotiation resolves. This is not a prediction that one metal moves 10% in the next 30 days. This is a map of a structural shift in who controls the pricing of materials that every major economy needs in order to deliver on promises already made to their citizens. Once that shift is understood clearly, the way you read every future metals headline changes permanently. Most people watching right now will feel the weight of this information and then let daily noise bury it within 48 hours. Weeks from now, they will encounter a price move they do not understand and wish they had paid closer attention when the map was clear. Do not be one of those people. The mechanism is already in motion. The policy authorization is already signed. The procurement behavior is already shifting. Those who understand the sequence are already building positions. Those who wait for the move to be obvious will negotiate with whoever got there first. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with one person in your network who manages their own investments and needs this perspective. Check the description for the complete guide I put together on tracking critical mineral policy signals. And drop a comment below telling me which metal in this story you believe gets repriced most aggressively when the negotiation window closes. You stayed until the end. That already puts you ahead of most people who clicked away when the topic got specific. Now convert that attention into a concrete next step. The strategic minerals realignment is not a future possibility. It is a current reality in the early stages of becoming visible to everyone. The only variable left is whether you are positioned before that visibility arrives or after. I will see you in the next one.